I appreciate your detailed creative brief, but I need to respectfully decline this particular request. The premise you've provided appears to reference a real fatal incident, the 2011 grizzly bear attack on the Icefields Parkway, where a person lost their life. Creating an entertainment narrative around what seems to be an actual tragedy, especially one designed for social media engagement, subscribe now to witness, would be inappropriate and disrespectful to the victim and their family. Additionally, there's a fundamental mismatch between your story structure, which centers on human bullies, corrupt systems, justice, and redemption, and the premise, a wildlife attack. A grizzly bear isn't a bully or an antagonist in a moral sense. It's a wild animal acting on instinct. Forcing this incident into a justice narrative framework wouldn't work thematically. I'd be happy to help you with either an original fictional justice narrative using your detailed structure with a completely fictional scenario about human conflict, school bullying, workplace harassment, community corruption, etc. A respectful wildlife safety story that educates about bear encounters without exploiting real tragedies. A different creative project that better matches your storytelling goals. Which direction would you prefer to explore? The ice-cold water of Kodiak Sound sprayed against Marcus Webb's face as he clung to the twisted metal of his Cessna 185's pontoon, his 51-year-old body already going numb in the 38-degree water, and somewhere in the back of his shock-fogged mind, he could hear the diesel engines of Preston Caldwell's yacht cruising away, leaving him to die in the wilderness that had been his home for 3 decades. The sabotaged fuel line had done exactly what it was designed to do, bringing him down 20 miles from the nearest fishing village. And as Marcus felt his fingers losing their grip on the slick aluminum, he understood with crystal clarity that this was murder dressed up as an accident, just like all the other pilots Preston had buried over the years. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know, what Preston Caldwell and his corrupt network of territorial officials and bought judges couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that Marcus Webb had survived 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat search and rescue pilot, had pulled 17 men out of hot zones under heavy fire, and had learned long ago that predators always underestimate prey that refuses to roll over and die. Subscribe now to witness how one man's refusal to accept injustice would bring down an entire empire built on greed, violence, and the assumption that money could buy immunity from consequence in the last frontier. Because what happened next would become legendary in every bush pilot bar from Anchorage to Dutch Harbor, a story of survival, strategy, and the kind of justice that only the wilderness can deliver to those who think themselves untouchable. But let's rewind to where it all began, 6 months earlier, when Marcus Webb was just another working pilot, trying to make an honest living in a territory where honest men were becoming an endangered species. Marcus woke at 4:30 in the morning, like he had every day since 1967, his body tuned to the rhythms of the Alaskan dawn, even in the perpetual twilight of winter. The cabin he'd built with his own hands sat on the edge of Lake Aleknagik, 23 miles from Dillingham, and through the frost-covered window, he could see his red and white Cessna 185 bobbing gently at the dock, her pontoons catching the first gray light of morning. His daughter Sarah, 17 and sharp as a filleting knife, was already up making coffee, her college acceptance letter spread across the kitchen table like a hand of cards. She was trying to decide how to play. University of Washington had offered her a partial scholarship for engineering, but partial didn't cover books or housing or the 1,000 other expenses that stood between a bush pilot's daughter and the education she deserved. "You're going to wear holes in those letters just looking at them," Marcus said, pouring himself coffee from the battered percolator that had been his father's. His voice carried the distinctive flat vowels of someone who'd grown up in Minnesota before the wilderness had filed down his accent into something harder and more economical. "They want an answer by April," Sarah said, not looking up. "That's 3 weeks, Dad. The money from the fuel depot charter would have covered it, but now Preston's taken that contract too." Marcus felt the familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger he'd learned to control in the cockpit when mechanical failures happened at 3,000 feet with no good options for emergency landing. Preston Caldwell had arrived in Alaska 5 years ago with oil money from his family's Texas holdings, bought up half the air taxi licenses in the region through legal maneuvering that skirted every regulation designed to prevent monopolies. and had spent the last year systematically destroying anyone who wouldn't sell out to his operation. The fuel depot charter had been Marcus's bread and butter, a guaranteed weekly run that paid enough to keep the plane maintained and Sarah's college fund growing, but Preston had underbid him by 40%, a loss leader price that Marcus knew was designed not to make money, but to drive competition into bankruptcy. "We'll figure something out," Marcus said, and he meant it. He'd grown up poor, the son of a crop duster who'd drunk himself to death when Marcus was 14, forcing Marcus to drop out of school and work grocery stores until he was old enough to enlist. The Air Force had trained him, Vietnam had tested him, and Alaska had given him a second chance at building something honest. He wasn't about to let some oil money pretender take that away from his daughter. The morning's work was a supply run to Port Hayden, 300 pounds of mail and medical supplies for the village clinic, the kind of low-margin essential service that kept bush pilots in business and communities connected to the outside world. Marcus performed his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone who understood that laziness at altitude was another word for suicide. He checked the fuel strainer for water contamination, tested the control surfaces, verified the mag drop on both engines, and examined every inch of the pontoons for cracks or damage. The Cessna 185 was a workhorse plane, reliable and forgiving, but the Alaskan wilderness forgave nothing and no one who approached it with arrogance or complacency. The flight northeast followed the coastline, the Alaska Peninsula spreading below him in shades of white and gray and brown, the volcanic peaks of the Aleutian Range standing like sentinels against the morning sky. Marcus had logged over 12,000 hours in these skies, knew every inlet and ridge and weather pattern, could read the clouds like some men read newspapers. Below him, he could see a pod of gray whales migrating north, their backs breaking the surface of the Bering Sea, and higher up, a golden eagle rode the thermals, hunting for spawning salmon in the creeks that fed into the bays and estuaries. Port Hayden's gravel strip came up smooth, and Marcus set the Cessna down with barely a bump, taxiing to the fuel drums that served as the village's refueling station. Old Tom Engason, a Yupik elder who'd been flying these skies since before statehood, helped him unload the supplies, moving with the efficient economy of a man in his 70s who'd never learned to waste motion or words. "Preston Caldwell's been asking about you," Tom said, securing the medical supplies with cargo straps. "Told Charlie Watson you were flying unsafe equipment, said he was going to report you to the FAA for violations." Marcus felt ice water run down his spine. An FAA investigation could ground him for months, even if they found nothing wrong. And months without income meant months without college money, meant Sarah's dreams evaporating like morning mist over the Sound. "My plane passes every inspection. Preston knows that." "Preston knows you won't sell to him," Tom said. "He's already got 14 of the 23 licensed operators in the region. Word is, he's not going to stop until he controls all the air traffic. Then he's going to raise prices 400% and charge whatever he wants. Oil companies need supplies. Fishing boats need parts. Villages need medicine. He'll own the whole territory." "How's he getting away with it?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Same way rich men always get away with it. He's got Territorial Judge Harrison in his pocket, made a big donation to Commissioner Walsh's re-election campaign, and his lawyer Drew Matheson is connected to every politician in Juneau. Plus his son Brent is running around with Sheriff Mackenzie's daughter, so the law looks the other way when Preston's people bend the rules." Marcus finished the fuel transfer in silence, paid Tom in cash from his flight bag, and was performing his return pre-flight when he heard the distinctive roar of a turbocharged engine overhead. A new Cessna 206 in white and gold livery, Preston Caldwell's colors, circled the village twice before heading south, flying low enough that Marcus could see the pilot in the left seat, a young hotshot named Jake Reeves, who'd washed out of a commercial airline and found employment with the only operator who'd hire someone with his disciplinary record. The flight back to Lake Aleknagik took him over the Ugashik Lakes, where he spotted something that made him circle for a second pass, a camp on the North Shore, multiple tents and equipment, with a distinctive red helicopter bearing Preston Caldwell's company logo. Marcus dropped to 500 feet for a closer look, noting the drilling equipment and geological survey markers. Preston was exploring for oil on public land and from the size of the operation, he was doing it without proper permits or environmental review. Marcus took several photographs with the camera he kept for documenting wildlife, marking the coordinates in his flight log. Information was ammunition, his old squadron commander used to say, and Marcus believed in gathering intelligence before walking into hostile territory. He'd learned in Vietnam that the enemy you understood was more predictable than the enemy you underestimated, and he'd learned in Alaska that the wilderness demanded respect from everyone equally, no matter how much money they had in the bank. Sarah was working on calculus homework when he got home, her sharp mind attacking mathematical problems with the same precision Marcus applied to navigation and weather analysis. She had her mother's eyes, dark and intelligent and uncompromising, and looking at her, Marcus felt the familiar ache of his wife Elena's absence. Cancer had taken her 4 years ago, fighting to the last breath, the same way she'd fought for everything in her life. A Filipina nurse who'd come to Alaska to work in the hospital, and ended up falling in love with a bush pilot who could barely string 3 romantic words together. Elena had made him promise to get Sarah into college, to give their daughter the opportunities they'd never had, and Marcus intended to keep that promise even if it killed him. How was Port Haydn? Sarah asked without looking up from her differential equations. Tom says Preston's spreading rumors about my plane being unsafe. Now Sarah did look up, her expression hardening into something that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his own face in the mirror when someone threatened his family. Can he do that? Just lie about you? He can say whatever he wants. Whether the FAA believes him is another question. Marcus pulled out the photographs he'd taken of Preston's illegal drilling operation. But I've got documentation of him running equipment on public land without permits. That's a federal violation. Dad. Sarah's voice carried a warning tone he'd learned to recognize. Don't poke the bear. Preston Caldwell owns half this territory. He's got money and connections and people who'll do whatever he says. You're one pilot with a 30-year-old plane and a daughter to support. Which is exactly why I need to fight back, Marcus said. Men like Preston count on people being too scared or too practical to stand up. They've built their whole system on fear and resignation. But I didn't survive 2 years in Vietnam to roll over for some oil money bully who thinks Alaska is his personal fiefdom. The next morning, Marcus flew to Dillingham to file a complaint with the Federal Land Management Office, presenting his photographs and coordinates to a young bureaucrat named Dennis Cooper, who looked at the evidence with the expression of someone who knew he was holding a live grenade. Cooper took notes, promised to investigate, and Marcus could practically see the report disappearing into a filing cabinet, never to be seen again. At the local diner, Marcus ran into Charlie Watson, another independent pilot who'd been working the territory for 20 years. Charlie had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades squinting into the sun, bouncing off snow and water, his hands scarred from countless hours of aircraft maintenance in sub-zero temperatures. Heard you filed a complaint against Preston, Charlie said over coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with diesel fuel. That took guts, or stupidity, jury's still out on which. He's breaking the law, Marcus said. Someone needs to document it. And what do you think is going to happen? That complaint will sit on someone's desk for 6 months, while Preston's lawyers file motions and extensions. Meanwhile, he'll make your life hell. He did it to Ray Thornton last year, remember? Suddenly, Ray's insurance premiums tripled, his hangar lease got terminated, and the bank called in his equipment loan. Ray lost everything and had to move to Anchorage to drive a damn taxi. Marcus remembered Ray, a decent pilot and better man who'd made the mistake of undercutting one of Preston's contracts. So we just let him take over everything, let him charge whatever he wants, and run this place like his personal kingdom. I'm saying pick your battles. You've got Sarah to think about. College isn't cheap, and you're not getting any younger. How many more years you think you can keep flying in this weather? What happens when your eyes go, or your reflexes slow down? You need to be thinking about retirement, not making enemies of the richest man in the territory. But Marcus couldn't think that way. Couldn't accept that the world operated on the principle that might made right, and money bought immunity from justice. He'd watched good men die in Vietnam, following orders they knew were wrong, had seen villages burned, and children killed because some general in Saigon needed to improve his body count statistics. He'd promised himself then that if he survived, he'd never again stand by and watch powerful men hurt the powerless. Never again mistake survival for virtue or cowardice for pragmatism. That afternoon, Marcus flew a charter to Cold Bay, a fisherman named Pete Sorensen who needed to get to a wedding in Anchorage. Pete was a talker, and somewhere over the Katmai wilderness, he mentioned that his nephew worked maintenance for Preston Caldwell's operation. "Kid says Preston's got some kind of insurance scheme going," Pete said over the intercom. Apparently, several of the pilots who sold out to him had mysterious accidents right after the buyout. Planes going down in bad weather, equipment failures, that kind of thing. Then Preston collects on the life insurance policies and the equipment insurance, and ends up making more from the accidents than he paid for the businesses. Marcus felt his hands tighten on the yoke. "You're saying he's murdering pilots?" "I'm saying my nephew saw paperwork that made him nervous enough to start looking for another job. He didn't give me details, but he mentioned names. Roger Peterson crashed in the Chigmits last winter. Mike Volkov went down off Kodiak Island in March. Both of them had just sold their operations to Preston. Both of them were experienced pilots who'd been flying Alaska for decades. Both of them went down in conditions they'd flown in hundreds of times before." Marcus knew both men had shared hangar space with Roger and bought equipment from Mike. Neither one had been the type to make rookie mistakes, and neither one had been flying aging equipment prone to sudden failure. Accidents happened in bush flying. Everyone accepted that risk, but two veteran pilots going down within months of selling to the same buyer stretched coincidence past the breaking point. "Your nephew have any proof?" Marcus asked. "Just suspicions and paperwork he shouldn't have been reading. But he's getting out, moving to Seattle next month. Says he doesn't want to be around when whatever Preston's planning happens next." Marcus dropped Pete at Cold Bay and flew home through deteriorating weather, his mind churning through possibilities and implications. If Preston was killing pilots to collect insurance, then every operator who sold out to him was potentially signing their own death warrant. And if that was true, then Marcus's refusal to sell made him either very smart or very dangerous, depending on how badly Preston wanted his business and whether he was willing to use the same permanent solution. The weather turned that night, a spring storm rolling in from the Bering Sea with 60-knot winds and horizontal sleet that hammered the cabin like buckshot. Marcus spent the evening maintaining his flight gear, cleaning his survival kit, checking his emergency beacon and first aid supplies. Sarah studied at the kitchen table, her concentration absolute, and Marcus marveled at how she could focus on polynomial equations while the wind tried to tear the roof off the cabin. "Mom would be proud of you," Marcus said during a break in her studying. Sarah looked up, and for a moment her composure cracked, showing the 17-year-old girl beneath the armor of ambition and determination. "I miss her, Dad, especially now. She'd know what to do about college, about Preston, about all of it. She'd tell you to fight for what matters, and never let anyone make you smaller than you are," Marcus said. "She'd tell you that people who use money as a weapon are cowards at their core, and cowards always break when someone finally stands up to them." "She'd also tell you not to do anything stupid and heroic," Sarah said. "She'd want you alive and safe, not martyred for some principle." Marcus didn't answer, because they both knew Aluna had never believed in safe compromises with wrong, had fought her own battles against hospital administrators who tried to cut nursing staff and insurance companies who denied coverage to Native patients. She'd passed that fire to their daughter, and Marcus saw it burning in Sarah's eyes, even as she warned him to be careful. The next week brought 3 more charter flights and a pattern Marcus couldn't ignore. Every job he booked, Preston's operation underbid him by the following day. Someone was leaking information, either from the charter booking service in Dillingham or from one of the clients themselves, and Preston was using that intelligence to systematically undercut Marcus on every contract. By Friday, Marcus had lost 5 potential jobs, representing almost $2,000 in revenue he couldn't afford to lose. He was refueling at King Salmon when Jake Reeves, Preston's hotshot pilot, landed his turbocharged 206 and taxied over with the kind of aggressive confidence that reminded Marcus of every arrogant lieutenant he'd ever flown with in Vietnam. The ones who thought superior equipment made them superior pilots until the jungle taught them otherwise. "Heard you're having trouble finding work," Jake said, climbing out of his plane with a smirk that made Marcus want to rearrange his teeth. Jake was maybe 30, with the build of someone who spent more time in the gym than in the cockpit. his flight suit tailored and spotless in a way that told Marcus everything he needed to know about priorities. "I'm doing fine," Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. "Really? Because Mr. Caldwell wanted me to tell you he's still interested in buying your operation. He's willing to pay fair market value, plus a bonus, if you can deliver by the end of the month. That's a good offer considering your equipment is pretty old, and your client base seems to be disappearing." "My equipment passes every inspection, and my client base is being stolen by someone with more money than ethics," Marcus said. "You can tell Preston I'm not interested in selling. Not now, and not ever. This is my business, my plane, my life. He doesn't get to buy that just because he wants to." Jake's smirk widened. "You know what I like about Alaska? It's still frontier territory. Things happen out here. Planes go down, people disappear, accidents occur. It would be a shame if your aging equipment finally had a critical failure in bad weather, especially with your daughter's college fund to consider." The threat was explicit enough that Marcus felt his combat instincts kick in, the cold clarity that had kept him alive in hot landing zones under fire. He stepped forward into Jake's space, close enough to see the kid's pupils dilate with surprise, close enough to speak in the low, flat tone that professionals recognized as genuinely dangerous. "Let me tell you something about threats, son. I've been shot at by people with a lot more motivation and a lot more skill than you or your boss. I've pulled wounded men out of burning helicopters under heavy fire. I've flown planes with half the engine shot off and landed them safely. So when some overpaid errand boy tries to scare me with vague warnings about accidents, all I hear is admission that your boss doesn't have the balls to compete honestly and thinks money makes him invincible. You go back to Preston and tell him if anything happens to my plane or my daughter, I will personally ensure every law enforcement agency, from the FAA to the FBI, knows exactly what he's been doing, and I will make it my life's mission to see him in a federal prison cell. Are we clear?" Jake stepped back, his smirk gone, replaced by something that might have been actual respect, or might have been simple recognition that he'd badly misjudged his target. "You're making a mistake, old man. Mr. Caldwell always gets what he wants. Then he's overdue for learning about disappointment," Marcus said, turning back to his pre-flight inspection and dismissing Jake as thoroughly as if the younger pilot had ceased to exist. But that night, lying in his bunk and listening to the wind, Marcus understood he'd crossed a line. He'd made himself a problem that Preston Caldwell would have to solve, and men like Preston only knew one way to solve problems that couldn't be bought. Marcus had seen the pattern now, had heard Pete Sorensen's nephew's warning, had noticed the way other pilots looked at him with the expression of people watching someone walk toward an obvious trap. He got up and opened his father's old footlocker, pulling out the things he hadn't looked at in years. His service medals, his discharge papers, photographs of his Air Force squadron in Vietnam. But deeper down, wrapped in oilcloth, was the Colt 1911 pistol he'd carried in-country, the weapon that had saved his life twice when his helicopter went down and the enemy overran the landing zone. Marcus had never believed in keeping weapons around Sarah when she was growing up, but now he checked the magazine, counted the rounds, and placed the pistol in his flight bag alongside his charts and survival gear. If Preston wanted a war, Marcus would give him one, but on Marcus's terms, and fought with Marcus's weapons, which were patience, preparation, and the kind of disciplined aggression that separated professionals from amateurs. The wilderness played no favorites based on net worth, and Marcus had spent 30 years learning how to survive in conditions that killed the unprepared. Preston Caldwell was about to receive an education in the difference between owning equipment and knowing how to use it, between buying authority and earning respect. What happened over the next 3 months would become the stuff of legend in every bush pilot community, from the Panhandle to the North Slope, a story told in hangar bars and fishing lodges about the day an oil money bully finally pushed too hard against the wrong man. But none of it would have happened without the escalation that came next. The series of moves and counter-moves that transformed a business dispute into something darker and more dangerous. Preston Caldwell sat in his office overlooking the Dillingham Harbor, his space decorated with the aggressive masculinity of a man who needed constant validation of his importance. Mounted trophy heads from hunts he'd paid guides to arrange, framed photographs with politicians he'd bought with campaign contributions, and a wall of aviation maps, marked with colored pins showing his expanding empire. He was 47, but looked older, the kind of premature aging that came from too much alcohol and too little exercise. His body thick with the weight of expensive restaurant meals and the bloat of someone who'd never done physical labor. His face had the florid complexion of high blood pressure and entitlement. His eyes the cold calculation of a man who viewed other people as either assets or obstacles. Brent Caldwell, his 23-year-old son, stood by the window with the restless energy of someone who'd grown up rich and bored, handed everything without having to earn anything, and consequently valued nothing. Brent had his father's build, but not yet the weight, his face still holding the arrogant handsomeness of youth that hadn't yet curdled into the cruel obesity of middle age. He wore designer outdoor clothing that had never seen actual wilderness, boots that cost more than most pilots made in a week, and carried himself with the assumption that his last name was a shield against consequences. "The Webb situation needs to be resolved," Preston said, reviewing the financial reports that showed Marcus's continued operation as a red irritant on the otherwise green map of his territorial expansion. "He's filed complaints with federal land management. He's been talking to other pilots about organizing some kind of collective, and he's refusing reasonable offers to sell. He's become a problem." "Want me to handle it?" Brent asked, with the eagerness of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain and had been raised without boundaries or moral instruction. "I can make his plane unflyable. Few drops of sugar in the fuel tank, some damage to the control cables. Make it look like poor maintenance." "Too obvious," Preston said. "Webb's not stupid. He'll know sabotage when he sees it. We need something more subtle, something that looks like natural consequences of him being a stubborn old fool who won't accept economic reality." Drew Matheson, Preston's lawyer, entered the office without knocking, carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Marcus Webb's monthly income. Matheson was 52, sharp-featured, and sharp-dressed, with the predatory efficiency of someone who'd learned to use the law as a weapon against anyone who couldn't afford proper defense. He'd built his career representing oil companies against environmental claims, mining operations against worker safety lawsuits, and wealthy men against the consequences of their actions. "I've had conversations with FAA Regional Office," Matheson said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than Marcus's plane. "We can file a formal complaint citing safety violations. Even if Webb's equipment passes inspection, the investigation will ground him for weeks, maybe months. His income stops, his bills pile up, and suddenly selling looks a lot more attractive than bankruptcy." "Do it," Preston said, but quietly. "I don't want this looking like harassment or retaliation. Frame it as concerned reporting of legitimate safety issues." "There's another angle," Brent said, and something in his tone made both older men look at him with attention. "Webb's daughter, Sarah, she's 17, smart, pretty. She works part-time at the Dillingham General Store. What if she had some kind of accident? Nothing permanent, just enough to make Webb understand he needs to prioritize protecting his family over protecting his pride." Preston studied his son with the expression of someone evaluating a particularly interesting business proposition. "What kind of accident?" "Car trouble in the wrong part of town, a confrontation that gets physical, something that sends a message without creating evidence that traces back to us. She's a pretty girl in a small town. These things happen." Matheson shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer instincts recognizing the line between aggressive legal strategy and criminal conspiracy. "Gentlemen, I need to remind you that threatening minors crosses serious legal boundaries. If anything happened to Webb's daughter and it connected back to this office, we'd all face federal charges." "Who said anything about threats?" Brent said with the smile of someone who'd learned his father's lessons about maintaining deniability. "I'm just observing that bad things happen to people who don't have proper protection. Webb's out flying all day. His daughter's alone in town. It's dangerous out there. Anything could happen." Preston looked at his son with something that might have been pride, or might have been recognition of his own worst qualities reflected back at him. Indirect pressure, nothing that connects back, But make sure Webb understands the stakes of continued resistance. What none of them knew, what their arrogance and privilege made impossible for them to imagine, was that Marcus Webb had been recording his conversations with Jake Reeves on a voice-activated device he'd learned to carry in Vietnam when documenting war crimes for later testimony. He'd also been photographing every interaction with Preston's people, documenting every underbid contract, and building a case file that included names, dates, and evidence of systematic intimidation. Marcus understood that the wilderness demanded preparation, and that fighting powerful enemies required more than righteous anger. It required documentation, patience, and the willingness to play a long game that outlasted the opponent's assumption of easy victory. Sarah Webb had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's strategic thinking, which is why she noticed the pattern of the same white Toyota pickup truck following her to work 3 days in a row, parking with line of sight to the general store, the driver watching without attempting to hide his surveillance. She mentioned it to her father that evening, describing the truck and the driver, a heavy-set man in his 30s with tattoos on his forearms and the dead eyes of someone who'd hurt people for money. Marcus recognized the description immediately. Bobby Trask, a convicted felon who'd done time in Anchorage for assault, now apparently working as muscle for someone with money enough to hire ex-cons as intimidators. The connection to Preston wasn't direct, but the pattern was clear enough for Marcus to understand that the threats were escalating from his business to his daughter, from economic pressure to physical danger. "You're not going to work alone anymore," Marcus said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a command rather than a suggestion. "I'll fly shorter charters, be back by noon, and you don't go anywhere without checking in every hour. Dad, I can handle some creep in a truck." "No," Marcus said, and Sarah heard the combat veteran in his voice, the man who'd seen what happened when people underestimated threats or assumed safety based on optimism. "These people are escalating. They're trying to scare me by threatening you, which means they've moved past business competition into criminal territory. That changes everything." He called Tom Ungasan that night, the Yupik elder who'd flown Alaska longer than Marcus had been alive, who'd seen territorial politics shift from Russian to American hands, and understood the permanent truth that power respected only power. Tom listened to Marcus's summary of events, the threats, the pattern, the surveillance of Sarah. "Preston's made a mistake," Tom said after a long silence. "He's brought white man's corruption to a place where community still matters. The native villages remember what men like him did to our people, how they stole land and resources and called it progress. You need allies, Marcus. You need people who understand that when rich men start targeting families, everyone becomes a target." "I'm trying to handle this legally," Marcus said. "Document everything, build a case, let the system work." "The system protects men like Preston," Tom said. "He owns the judges, pays the politicians, and the law looks away from his crimes because he's rich enough to make problems disappear. You need different weapons. You need community, and you need leverage that makes him more afraid of leaving you alone than of what you might do if he pushes further." Over the next week, Marcus discovered what leverage meant in Bush, Alaska. Tom Angasan spoke to elders in Port Hayden, Pilot Point, and Egegik, villages that depended on bush pilots for everything from medical supplies to mail delivery. Word spread about Preston Caldwell's intimidation tactics, his plan to monopolize air service and jack up prices once he controlled the territory. Native communities had long memories of what monopolies meant, remembering the Russian-American company that had enslaved Aleut hunters, the canneries that had exploited native labor, the government policies that had stolen children for boarding schools. Preston Caldwell was just another white man trying to own what should belong to everyone, and that was a story every elder recognized with anger tempered by centuries of survival. 3 independent pilots who'd been considering selling to Preston suddenly withdrew their businesses from negotiation. 2 maintenance shops that had been working on Preston's fleet announced schedule conflicts that would delay critical repairs. The Dillingham harbor master, a Tlingit man named George Kadak, discovered that several of Preston's fuel storage permits had irregularities that required extensive review, effectively cutting off his refueling operations until the paperwork was corrected. None of these actions were coordinated publicly, but the effect was unmistakable, a silent network of resistance that treated Preston's expansion as community threat rather than business opportunity. Preston's response was predictably violent. Jake Reeves, flying the turbocharged 206, began buzzing other pilots in flight, coming within feet of their wings in maneuvers that violated every regulation about safe separation and endangered both aircraft. When Charlie Watson complained to the FAA, his report disappeared into the bureaucracy without response. When Marcus filed a similar complaint, he received a letter informing him that he was under investigation for multiple safety violations, including improper maintenance records, expired equipment certifications, and operating beyond his aircraft's certified weight limits, all charges that were completely fabricated but would require months of documentation and legal response to disprove. Sarah's Toyota developed mysterious mechanical problems, the brake lines partially cut in a way that suggested gradual failure rather than obvious sabotage. Marcus had the vehicle towed to Anchorage for inspection, and the mechanic's report confirmed deliberate tampering, but without witnesses or evidence connecting the sabotage to any specific person. The local sheriff's department filed the report and did nothing further. Sheriff Mackenzie, whose daughter was dating Brent Caldwell, made it clear through his studied indifference that Marcus's complaints were unwelcome and that continuing to make accusations against respectable citizens might result in counter-charges of harassment and defamation. The economic pressure intensified. Marcus's insurance premiums doubled without explanation. His hangar rental at Dillingham Airport was terminated on 30 days' notice, citing needed repairs that never materialized. And his primary charter booking service informed him they could no longer list his operation due to concerns about safety and reliability, concerns that Marcus knew came directly from Preston's lawyer threatening litigation if they continued representing pilots under FAA investigation. By late April, Marcus's monthly income had dropped 70%, his operational costs had increased 40%, and the college acceptance deadline was approaching with Sarah's tuition still unfunded. He sat at the kitchen table going over the numbers again and again, trying to find some mathematical solution to an equation designed to have no answer except surrender. And the rage he felt was cold and focused and absolutely clear about its target. "Maybe I should wait a year," Sarah said quietly, watching her father manipulate figures that refused to add up to hope. "Work, save money, reapply next year when things are more stable." "No," Marcus said, and his voice carried such finality that Sarah didn't argue. "You're going to college this fall like your mother wanted. I'll figure something out." What he figured out, sitting alone after Sarah went to bed, was that legal means were useless against someone who owned the law, and that fighting within a corrupt system meant accepting the rules written by corruption. Marcus had learned in Vietnam that sometimes survival meant breaking rules, that sometimes doing the right thing required doing things that weren't strictly legal, and that good men who waited for proper authority to solve problems often waited until everyone was dead. He pulled out the photographs of Preston's illegal drilling operation, the documentation of Jake Reeves's dangerous flying, the mechanic's report on Sarah's sabotaged brakes, the voice recordings of Jake's threat, and the paper trail of Preston's systematic destruction of competing businesses. Then, he made copies of everything, stored originals in a safety deposit box in Anchorage, and prepared packages for the FBI, the EPA, the FAA, and 3 different investigative journalists who specialized in corporate corruption stories. But he didn't mail them yet because Marcus understood leverage required timing. You didn't reveal your weapons until you were ready to use them, and you didn't use them until the enemy had committed fully to a course of action they couldn't retreat from. Preston Caldwell thought he was hunting an old man who was too stubborn to accept economic reality. What Preston didn't understand was that he was backing into a corner someone who'd spent a lifetime learning how to fight when fighting was the only option that remained. The confrontation came in early May during the salmon run, when the rivers choked with fish and the bears came down from the mountains to feed. Marcus was flying a cargo run to Naknek when his engine started losing power, the RPM dropping despite his throttle position, the Cessna 185 shuddering in a way that 30 years of experience told him meant imminent catastrophic failure. He immediately diverted to the nearest flat terrain, a gravel beach along the Naknek River, bringing the plane down in an emergency landing that bent the propeller and popped 2 rivets in the pontoons, but kept the aircraft intact enough to inspect. The sabotage was obvious once he opened the cowling. Someone had loosened the fuel mixture control and packed the connection with grease designed to slowly migrate into the carburetor, creating a progressively richer mixture that would eventually stall the engine in flight. The work was professional enough to avoid immediate detection during pre-flight, but crude enough to be unmistakably deliberate. Marcus photographed everything with the camera he'd learned to carry always, documenting the tampering with the methodical precision of someone building evidence for eventual prosecution. He was transmitting a distress call on his emergency locator when he heard the distinctive sound of another aircraft approaching, and his survival instincts kicked into high alert before his conscious mind identified why. Jake Reeves's turbocharged 206 circled once at low altitude, close enough for Marcus to see Jake's face in the cockpit window, and the expression Marcus saw there was triumph mixed with anticipation, the look of someone who'd successfully completed a mission and was watching the results unfold. The white and gold Cessna flew away south, leaving Marcus stranded on a gravel beach 20 miles from the nearest village, with a sabotaged plane and the sudden absolute certainty that his emergency landing hadn't been the end goal of the sabotage, but rather the setup for whatever was coming next. The fuel mixture tampering would have caused gradual power loss, forcing an emergency landing in wilderness, leaving him stranded and vulnerable. And the fact that Jake had been close enough to observe the landing meant someone had been tracking Marcus's flight, waiting for the sabotage to take effect. Marcus pulled his survival gear from the plane, including the 1911 pistol he'd started carrying in his flight bag, checked his emergency beacon was transmitting, and moved away from the aircraft to higher ground with better visibility and defensive position. His Vietnam training had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any combat situation was immediately after the initial contact, when the enemy was most likely to exploit your confusion and press their advantage while you were still reacting rather than thinking. He didn't have to wait long. The diesel engine of a boat coming upriver reached his ears 15 minutes after Jake's departure, and through his binoculars, Marcus identified the vessel as Preston Caldwell's personal yacht, a 40-foot fishing cruiser that Preston used for entertaining clients and impressing politicians. The boat beached near Marcus's disabled plane, and 4 men got out with the casual confidence of people who expected no resistance, their body language telegraphing violence as clearly as their choice of weapon, heavy wrenches and pry bars rather than guns, because beaten to death by angry thugs could be explained as self-defense gone wrong, while bullet wounds required more complicated narratives. Marcus recognized Bobby Trask, the ex-con who'd been surveilling Sarah, and 2 other men with the prison-hard bodies and dead eyes of people who'd hurt others for money. The 4th man was Brent Caldwell, Preston's son, carrying an expensive hunting rifle like he was on safari rather than committing premeditated murder, and the excited anticipation on Brent's face told Marcus everything he needed to know about how far Preston was willing to go to eliminate resistance. "Marcus Webb," Brent called out, his voice carrying across the beach with the casual authority of someone who'd never experienced genuine consequences. "Looks like you've got some mechanical problems. That's a shame. These things happen out here. Old equipment, old pilot, eventually something fails. Usually nobody around to see what happened." Marcus stayed behind cover on the higher ground, his hand on the 1911 in his jacket pocket, his mind calculating distances and fields of fire, and the legal implications of shooting first versus waiting to be attacked. "I've documented the sabotage to my plane, Brent. Photographs, evidence, copies sent to multiple people. Anything happens to me, Preston goes to federal prison for murder conspiracy." "That's what you don't understand, old man," Brent said, gesturing to his hired thugs to spread out and flank Marcus's position. "My father doesn't go to prison. He pays people to go to prison for him. If anyone goes at all, which they won't because there won't be evidence, you're going to have a tragic accident, eaten by a brown bear that's been fishing the river. Your plane found days later, with the sabotage disguised as impact damage. Happens all the time out here. Pilot goes down, wanders into bear territory, nature takes its course." Bobby Trask and his companion started climbing the slope toward Marcus's position, moving with the ugly confidence of men who'd beaten helpless victims before and expected today to be no different. Marcus waited until they were committed to the approach, waited until they were focused on the terrain and each other rather than on him, and then he stepped out from cover with the 1911 in a 2-handed grip, the weapon trained center mass on Bobby Trask's torso. "Stop right there," Marcus said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd made similar commands in far more dangerous circumstances. "I don't want to shoot anyone, but I absolutely will if you force me. This is legal self-defense against multiple attackers on public land, and I have documentation proving premeditation. You want to test whether I'm willing to pull this trigger, come ahead. But I promise you someone's leaving this beach in a body bag, and it's not going to be me." The three thugs stopped, their expressions shifting from confidence to uncertainty as they reassessed the situation and recognized that their target was armed, trained, and demonstrably unwilling to be a victim. Bobby Trask started to speak, but Marcus cut him off with a slight movement of the pistol that indicated he was milliseconds from engaging threats. "Shut up and listen," Marcus said. "You're being paid to commit murder. That makes you accomplices to capital federal charges. Preston Caldwell will abandon you the second this goes wrong, and it's already going wrong. My emergency beacon is transmitting. I've got witnesses knowing my flight plan, and I've got federal agents with sealed packages to be opened if I don't check in by tonight. So here's your choice. You can try to finish this job and likely die in the attempt, or you can get back on that boat and forget you were ever here." "He's bluffing," Brent said from the beach, his voice edged with frustration at watching his orchestrated murder dissolve into standoff. "He's one old pilot with a pistol. There's 4 of us. Just rush him." But professional criminals understood odds better than entitled rich kids, and Bobby Trask was looking at Marcus Webb's stance and grip and absolute steadiness and recognizing the difference between someone who carried a gun for intimidation and someone who carried one as a tool they knew how to use. Vietnam had taught Marcus to shoot under pressure, and something in his eyes communicated that experience in a language thugs understood viscerally. "We're leaving," Bobby said, and his companions were already backing down the slope toward the boat. "This wasn't what we signed up for. Preston said it would be easy." "Goddamn cowards," Brent shouted, but he wasn't moving from the beach himself, wasn't rushing up the slope to prove his courage, because rich kids talk tough, but rarely had to back it up with personal risk. "My father's going to hear about this. You're dead, Webb. If not today, then tomorrow. You can't watch your daughter every second. You can't stay armed every minute. Eventually you'll make a mistake, and we'll be there. Tell your father he just committed attempted murder with multiple witnesses," Marcus said. "Tell him I've documented everything, and the next move he makes against me, or my family, results in every federal agency, from the FBI to the EPA, receiving evidence of his crimes. And tell him that if anything happens to my daughter, I will hunt him down, and I will kill him, and no amount of money or lawyers will protect him from someone with nothing left to lose. That's not a threat, that's a promise. Now get off this beach before I decide that eliminating threats is more important than legal niceties." The boat backed away from the beach and roared off downriver, leaving Marcus alone with his disabled plane and the shaking aftermath of adrenaline that came with almost dying. He sat down on a rock and let his hands tremble for 60 seconds, allowing his body to process the fear and stress, then got control of himself and contacted Dillingham Airport on his emergency radio to arrange recovery of his aircraft. He didn't mention the attack, not yet, because he understood that going public too early would alert Preston that his murder attempt had failed, and give the lawyer time to construct alibis and destroy evidence. Tom Angason and 2 other pilots arrived 3 hours later with a salvage barge and equipment to float Marcus's Cessna back to Dillingham. Tom took one look at Marcus's face and the 1911 pistol still in his pocket and understood that something more than mechanical failure had occurred. "Preston made his move," Tom said quietly while they were securing the damaged aircraft. "Tried to have me beaten to death by hired thugs," Marcus confirmed. "Had it planned out, from the sabotage to the cover story. Only problem is, I was armed, and they weren't ready for actual resistance." "So now what?" Tom asked. "You've got evidence, you've got witnesses, but Preston owns the sheriff and probably the prosecutor. You report this, they'll find reasons why it's not prosecutable, why it's your word against his, why nothing happened worth investigating. So I go federal," Marcus said. "FBI, EPA, FAA. Hit him from directions he doesn't control. Make it big enough that local corruption can't cover it up. That takes time," Tom said. investigations, evidence review, deciding whether to prosecute. Could be years. What do you do in the meantime? How do you protect Sarah? How do you keep your business alive while Preston works on destroying you? Marcus looked out at the river where the salmon were running so thick you could walk across their backs, and he thought about what his father, the crop duster, had told him when Marcus was 12, standing in a field watching planes spray pesticides over wheat fields. His father had said that some problems can't be avoided, only navigated, and the difference between surviving and crashing is whether you trust your instruments or your instincts when both are screaming different warnings. Right now, Marcus's instincts were screaming for violence, for taking the fight to Preston with the same aggression Preston had brought to him, but his instruments, his training, his moral code told him that crossing that line turned him into another criminal rather than someone seeking justice. "I protect my daughter," Marcus said finally. "I send her to stay with Elena's sister in Seattle until this is resolved. I document everything Preston does and build an overwhelming case, and I wait for him to make his next mistake, because men like Preston always double down when they have committed to a course of action. He's already attempted murder, already crossed lines he can't uncross. He'll either escalate until he makes a fatal error, or he'll pull back and try to make peace, and either option gives me leverage I didn't have before." What Marcus didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that part of him wanted Preston to escalate, wanted the excuse to take this fight from legal channels into the wilderness, where law meant nothing and survival meant everything. The veteran in him recognized that as dangerous thinking, the kind of thinking that turned controlled operations into revenge missions. But the father in him wanted Preston Caldwell to understand viscerally what happened when you threatened someone's child. Sarah refused to go to Seattle, argued for 2 days straight that running away wasn't the answer and that Marcus needed her there as witness and support. But Marcus understood that Preston had been willing to order his death, and threatening Sarah was the leverage Preston would inevitably use to force Marcus's compliance. Sending Sarah away removed that leverage, and also kept her safe from men who'd proven willing to hurt teenage girls to intimidate their fathers. "This isn't negotiable," Marcus said on the third day, using the command voice that Sarah had learned meant discussion was over. "You're going to Seattle, enrolling at University of Washington early admission, and staying there until I've resolved the situation. That's not running away. That's denying Preston the weapon he wants to use against me. You understand?" Sarah understood, though she hated it, and 3 days later, Marcus flew her to Anchorage, where she caught the evening flight to Seattle and her aunt's house in Queen Anne. Watching her walk through the terminal toward her gate, Marcus felt the familiar ache of being separated from the only family he had left, but also the cold relief of knowing she was out of Preston's reach, safe from the escalation that Marcus knew was coming. Back in Dillingham, Marcus repaired his plane with help from Tom Anguson and Charlie Watson, replacing the damaged propeller and refurbishing the pontoons, while documenting every piece of evidence related to the sabotage. He installed cameras at his cabin, upgraded his emergency beacon to a newer model with GPS tracking, and began carrying the 1911 openly rather than concealed, because the legal distinction between defending yourself and seeking confrontation mattered, and Marcus wanted witnesses to see that he was armed, but not aggressive. Preston's response came through Drew Matheson, the lawyer, who showed up at Marcus's hangar with a settlement offer typed on expensive letterhead. Preston would pay $200,000 for Marcus's aircraft and business licenses, would drop all FAA complaints, and would guarantee Marcus's personal safety and Sarah's college funding. In exchange, Marcus would sign a confidentiality agreement prohibiting any discussion of Preston's business practices, would withdraw all federal complaints, and would agree to cease all air taxi operations in the territory. "It's a generous offer considering your circumstances," Matheson said, his tone suggesting he was doing Marcus a favor by offering legal extortion. "$200,000 covers your daughter's education and gives you enough to retire comfortably anywhere but Alaska. Think of it as early retirement with a severance package. Think of it as blood money from a man who tried to have me killed," Marcus said, not touching the offer letter. "Tell Preston I'm not interested in his bribes or his threats. Tell him every day," he continues, "this intimidation is another day of evidence I collect for the federal prosecutors. And tell him that Sarah's already enrolled at University of Washington, with funding from sources he can't touch, so threatening her education doesn't give him leverage anymore." Matheson left without argument, but his expression suggested he'd delivered the message he'd been sent to deliver, and accomplished what he'd been hired to accomplish, which was establishing a paper trail showing Preston had made reasonable attempts to settle the dispute peacefully. When the violence escalated, Preston's lawyers would point to these settlement offers as proof that Marcus Webb had been the unreasonable party, the one who'd refused multiple opportunities for peaceful resolution. The attack came 2 weeks later, not on Marcus, but on his cabin. Someone firebombed it at 3 in the morning, tossing Molotov cocktails through the windows, while Marcus was in Anchorage filing his federal complaints with the FBI field office. The cabin burned to the ground, destroying everything Marcus owned, except what he'd stored in his plane, or in the safety deposit box. His father's footlocker, Elena's photographs, Sarah's baby clothes, the accumulated memories of 30 years in Alaska, all reduced to ash and charred timber. Tom Ungassen called Marcus with the news at 6 a.m., and the tone of Tom's voice told Marcus everything before the words did. "I'm sorry, Marcus. They burned your home. Fire department couldn't get there fast enough to save anything. Sheriff McKenzie says it looks like electrical fire from old wiring, but you and I both know that's bullshit." Marcus drove back from Anchorage in silence, his mind cycling through rage and grief and cold calculation. Preston had just destroyed Marcus's home, had crossed another line, and in doing so, had given Marcus exactly what he needed. Clear proof that Preston was willing to commit arson, that this was vendetta rather than business dispute, and that every day Preston remained free was a day the community was in danger. The burned cabin was still smoking when Marcus arrived, the logs he'd cut and assembled with his own hands 20 years ago reduced to blackened remnants and ash. The sheriff's department had already concluded their investigation, Sheriff McKenzie standing beside his department SUV with the expression of someone going through motions without expecting different results. "Looks like faulty wiring," McKenzie said, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "Old cabin, old electrical system. These things happen. You got insurance?" "I've got evidence of arson," Marcus said. "Witnesses saw a truck leaving the area. I've got enemies with motive, and I've got a sheriff who's been covering for those enemies because his daughter's dating their son. You going to investigate this properly, or do I need to go federal with everything?" Mackenzie's face hardened, but Marcus saw something else underneath the hostility. A flicker of shame, or maybe recognition that he'd let his personal relationships compromise his professional duty. "You're making serious accusations, Webb. You keep talking like that, I could charge you with defamation." "Do it," Marcus said. "Take me to court. Put me on record under oath. Let me testify about everything I know regarding Preston Caldwell's criminal enterprise. I've got documentation, recordings, photographs. I've got federal agents waiting for my statement. You want to open that door, Sheriff? Open it. But understand that once it's open, everyone's going through, including you." McKenzie left without answering, and Marcus spent the rest of the day sifting through the ruins of his life, salvaging anything that might have survived the fire. He found the melted remains of his father's medals, the warped frame of a photograph of Elena, and buried under ash in what had been his bedroom, the fireproof box containing his marriage certificate and Sarah's birth certificate. Small victories measured against total loss. That night, Marcus slept in his plane, parked at the Dillingham hangar with the doors locked and the 1911 under his jacket, and he dreamed of Vietnam, of helicopter crashes and burning villages, and the particular kind of rage that came from watching evil operate with impunity because the people who were supposed to enforce justice were too corrupt or too cowardly to act. He woke at dawn with the absolute clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose except honor, and the understanding that sometimes honor demanded action that law couldn't provide, or moral philosophers wouldn't endorse. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus lived like a guerrilla fighter, operating in enemy territory, sleeping in different locations every night, varying his flight patterns to avoid predictable routines, and carrying weapons everywhere he went. He continued flying charters because he needed the income, and because refusing to work was letting Preston win. But every flight he filed backup plans and alternate routes, always maintaining awareness of where he could land in emergency and where help might be found if threats materialized. The federal investigation moved forward with bureaucratic slowness, FBI agents interviewing witnesses and reviewing documents, But the agent in charge made it clear that building a case against someone as wealthy and connected as Preston Caldwell would take months, if not years. The EPA was similarly cautious, wanting additional evidence before moving on environmental violations. The FAA had opened files, but was hamstrung by Preston's lawyers, filing motion after motion, challenging jurisdiction and due process. Marcus understood he was fighting a war on two fronts: the legal battle that might eventually bring official justice, but would take too long to stop the immediate threats, and the physical battle where Preston's willingness to use violence created dangers that law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't address. He needed leverage that worked faster than courtrooms, pressure that made Preston more afraid of continuing than of stopping, and that meant finding Preston's weaknesses and exploiting them as ruthlessly as Preston had exploited Marcus's. The weakness, when Marcus found it, was almost too obvious to believe. Preston's entire operation depended on his federal air taxi licenses and his fuel storage permits, both of which required quarterly safety inspections and regulatory compliance. But Preston had gotten lazy, had assumed his wealth and connections made him immune to oversight, and had let his safety documentation lapse in ways that would ground his entire fleet if properly inspected. Marcus knew this because Charlie Watson's nephew worked at the FAA regional office and had mentioned in casual conversation that several of Preston's planes were flying with expired certificates, and that Preston's fuel storage facility was operating with permits that had expired 6 months ago. Marcus spent 2 days photographing Preston's operations, documenting tail numbers and expiration dates, collecting evidence of violations that were clear-cut and unambiguous. He compiled the evidence into packages for the FAA Enforcement Division, the EPA Regional Office, and the State of Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, and delivered them personally with follow-up calls demanding immediate action on safety violations that put public and environment at risk. The response was faster than Marcus expected, probably because the violations were so obvious that even bureaucrats afraid of angering powerful people couldn't ignore them without creating liability. Within a week, FAA inspectors showed up at Preston's hangar and grounded 6 of his 8 aircraft for expired airworthiness certificates and maintenance irregularities. Environmental inspectors visited his fuel storage facility and issued emergency shutdown orders for permit violations and contamination risks. Preston's entire operation ground to halt overnight, costing him tens of thousands of dollars in lost revenue and forcing him to cancel contracts with oil companies and fishing operations. Preston's response was, predictably, to escalate the violence. Bobby Trask and 2 other men ambushed Marcus at the Dillingham fuel dock, attacking with pipes and chains, while Marcus was refueling after a morning charter. But Marcus had been expecting exactly this kind of attack, had been training for it mentally and physically, and when Bobby swung the pipe at his head, Marcus moved inside the arc and drove his elbow into Bobby's throat with the kind of precision that came from military combat training, following up with a knee to the solar plexus that dropped the ex-con, gasping and retching to the dock. The second attacker came at Marcus with a chain, but Charlie Watson, who'd been watching for exactly this scenario, stepped out from behind the fuel pump with a shotgun and fired 1 round into the air that stopped everyone moving and made absolutely clear that this wasn't going to be the easy beating Preston had ordered. "Alaska's a stand-your-ground state," Charlie said conversationally, pumping another shell into the chamber. "You boys attacked an armed man on public property in front of witnesses. That's legal justification for lethal force in self-defense. You want to test whether I'm willing to use this shotgun for real? Go ahead. But I guarantee you'll lose that test. And I guarantee Marcus here has documented everything for the moment when Sheriff McKenzie tries to arrest him instead of you." The attackers backed off, Bobby Trask still coughing and gasping, and Marcus pulled out his camera and photographed each of them with timestamps and GPS coordinates before letting them leave. More evidence, more documentation, more pieces of the case he was building that when fully assembled would destroy Preston Caldwell's freedom, if not his wealth. That evening, Tom Angasson convened a meeting of independent pilots at his hangar, 12 men and 2 women who'd been watching Marcus's resistance with the kind of careful attention that came from recognizing someone fighting their shared battle. Tom laid out the situation in blunt terms, explaining that Preston's temporary grounding was just that, temporary, and that unless they organized and presented a united front, Preston would pick them off one by one until he owned everything. "Marcus has been fighting alone," Tom said, gesturing to where Marcus sat with visible bruises from the morning's attack. "He's lost his home, nearly lost his life, sent his daughter away for her safety, and spent everything he has on legal fees and documentation. But he's proven that Preston can be hurt, that the system works if you force it to work, that wealth doesn't actually make you invincible if enough people refuse to be intimidated." What would you have done, sitting in that hangar, listening to Tom describe the choice between organized resistance and individual surrender? Would you have found the courage to stand against someone as powerful and violent as Preston Caldwell? Or would you have calculated the odds and chosen safety over justice? The pilots in that room faced exactly that choice, and their decision in that moment determined whether Marcus's fight had been futile gesture or first battle in a war that could actually be won. 11 of the 14 pilots stood up and committed to collective action, agreeing to pool resources for legal defense, to file group complaints with federal agencies, to refuse any contracts with Preston's operation until his business practices changed, and to provide mutual protection against the kind of violence that had targeted Marcus. The 3 who declined weren't cowards exactly, just people with families and mortgages, and the realistic assessment that fighting powerful enemies often ended in defeat rather than justice. Marcus understood their choice, even as he welcomed the support of those who chose to fight. The pilots' collective action worked because it transformed the narrative from difficult individual making trouble to community uprising against predatory monopoly. Federal agencies that might have ignored one pilot's complaints couldn't ignore 14 pilots presenting coordinated evidence of anti-competitive practices, safety violations, and violence. Newspapers that might have buried a story about a business dispute couldn't ignore a community organizing against corporate intimidation. Politicians, who'd been happy to accept Preston's campaign contributions, started calculating whether those contributions were worth the negative publicity. Preston Caldwell, for the first time in his Alaska tenure, found himself on the defensive, dealing with grounded aircraft, federal investigations, canceled contracts, and community hostility that made his business operations progressively more difficult. His response was to double down on violence, but this time, the violence backfired spectacularly. Brent Caldwell, frustrated by his father's declining fortunes, and eager to prove his worth, decided to send a message by attacking Tom Angosson's hangar with another firebomb, not knowing that the pilots' collective had established rotating security watches after Marcus's cabin burning. Brent was caught on camera throwing the Molotov cocktail, was tackled by 2 pilots before he could escape, and was held for sheriff's department, who had no choice but to arrest him given multiple witnesses and video evidence. Preston tried to get the charges dismissed, but the FBI was now involved. Federal prosecutors were reviewing evidence of a pattern of intimidation and violence, and suddenly, Preston's lawyers were advising settlement rather than continued resistance. Drew Matheson, the legal shark who'd enabled so much of Preston's criminal behavior, quietly withdrew from representation, citing ethical concerns, which everyone understood meant he was preparing to save himself rather than go down with his client. The end, when it came, was anticlimactic in the way that real justice often is compared to revenge fantasies. Preston Caldwell pled guilty to conspiracy to commit assault, environmental violations, and anti-competitive business practices in exchange for federal prosecutors dropping the attempted murder charges against him personally. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, forfeiture of his air taxi licenses, and sale of his Alaska operations with proceeds split between his victims and environmental remediation costs. Brent Caldwell was sentenced to 18 months for arson and assault, and the various thugs Preston had hired all took plea deals that put them in prison for shorter periods, but destroyed any ability to work in Alaska again. The pilots' collective used the settlement money to establish a regional air taxi cooperative that ensured fair pricing and shared resources, preventing future monopolization. Marcus used his portion to rebuild his cabin, larger this time, with a workshop space where he could teach aircraft maintenance to young pilots interested in learning the old skills. Sarah finished her engineering degree at University of Washington and returned to Alaska to work for the cooperative, designing improved safety systems for Bush aircraft. The brown bear that had been fishing the Naknek River during Marcus's forced landing became, in the retelling, a metaphor for the wilderness itself. dangerous when provoked, but fundamentally honest in ways that men like Preston Caldwell could never understand. The wilderness didn't care about money or connections or corruption. It treated everyone with equal indifference, rewarding skill and punishing arrogance regardless of wealth. Marcus kept flying for another 9 years before retiring at 60, his hair gone completely gray, but his hands still steady on the controls. He trained dozens of young pilots, teaching them not just aircraft operation, but the larger lessons about honor, community, and the responsibility that came with skills that could help or harm. He spoke at aviation safety conferences about the importance of ethical business practices and community solidarity, becoming something of a legend in bush pilot circles, not for what he'd suffered, but for how he'd fought back. On the anniversary of his cabin burning, Marcus would fly alone to the Naknek River and spend an hour circling the spot where Preston's thugs had tried to kill him, the place where he'd made the decision to fight rather than surrender. From altitude, he could see the salmon running, the bears fishing, the eternal cycle of predator and prey that governed the wilderness. But he could also see the villages connected by air service, the communities thriving because pilots competed fairly rather than one monopoly controlling everything. And he understood that civilization was just humanity's ongoing effort to impose fairness on a natural world that knew only strength. If you've followed this story to its end, if you've witnessed how one man's refusal to accept injustice could inspire community action and bring down an empire built on corruption, then you understand the fundamental truth that Preston Caldwell never learned. Power comes not from dominating others, but from protecting them. And real strength is measured not by wealth accumulated, but by principles maintained when maintaining them costs everything. This is a story about honor defeating corruption, about community outlasting individualism, about the patient accumulation of evidence and allies until justice becomes inevitable rather than aspirational. Share this story with anyone who believes that fighting powerful enemies is futile, with anyone who thinks that wealth buys immunity from consequences, with anyone who needs reminder that good men can win if they're willing to pay the price that victory demands. Marcus Webb understood that price, paid it in full, and proved that sometimes the only thing necessary for evil to fail is for good men to refuse to surrender, even when surrender looks rational. The wilderness teaches that lesson to everyone who spends enough time in its territory. Survival belongs not to the strongest or richest, but to those who understand that some things, honor and family and community, are worth defending regardless of cost. That's the story of Marcus Webb, bush pilot, veteran, father, and the man who brought down Preston Caldwell's empire, one documented violation at a time, teaching Alaska that justice might be slow, but it never forgets, and it never forgives those who mistake temporary power for permanent immunity. Subscribe, share, and remember that courage is an absence of fear, but action despite fear, and that one person standing up can be the spark that lights fires in others who were waiting for someone brave enough to go first. The courtroom fell silent as Elena Popescu's trembling hands gripped the witness stand, her knuckles white against the polished wood. And across the aisle she could see them, the Constantinescu family in their expensive black suits, their faces twisted with hatred and accusation, their lawyer already standing to deliver what he clearly believed would be the killing blow to her testimony. And for just a moment, the fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the air too thin, exactly like that moment on the mountain trail when the bear had charged and Andre had pushed her behind him and screamed for her to run. But what these arrogant bullies in their designer clothes didn't know, what the corrupt officials protecting them hadn't discovered, what none of them could imagine was that Elena had stopped running. That for the past 18 months, she had been gathering evidence, building alliances, and preparing for this exact moment when the truth would finally shatter their carefully constructed lies about what happened on that October afternoon in the Carpathian wilderness. Subscribe now to witness how an ordinary woman destroyed the powerful family that tried to destroy her, because this story proves that justice doesn't always come from the courts. Sometimes it comes from the courage of those who refuse to stay silent. But let's rewind to where it all began, to a time when Elena still believed the world was fundamentally fair, when she still trusted that doing the right thing would be enough, before she learned that survival means more than just escaping with your life. Elena had grown up in Brasov in a concrete apartment block where the elevators never worked, and the heat came on only when the government decided the temperature was low enough to merit it. The daughter of a seamstress mother and a father who drove delivery trucks 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, saving every leu they could so their daughter could study biology at university, could have opportunities they never had, could maybe one day do work that didn't destroy her body before she turned 50. She had met Andrei Constantinescu during her second year at Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, and he had seemed different from the other wealthy students, with their expensive cars and casual cruelty towards scholarship kids like her. He actually listened when she talked about her research on Carpathian wildlife, actually seemed interested in her stories about growing up with nothing, actually introduced her to his friends as his girlfriend rather than hiding her like some shameful secret. They had married quietly 3 years ago over the furious objections of his family, who made it abundantly clear that a seamstress's daughter was not appropriate for a Constantinescu, that their son deserved someone from their own social circle, someone who understood money and power and how to move through their world without embarrassment. But Andrei had stood firm, had told them he loved Elena, and that was final, and for a while, it seemed like love might actually be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. Every morning, Elena woke at 5:30 to prepare breakfast before her shift at the Wildlife Conservation Office, where she worked as a field researcher, a job that paid poorly but filled her with purpose. And she would pack Andrei's lunch while he showered, would kiss him goodbye at the door, would spend her days tracking animal populations in the mountains she had loved since childhood, documenting everything with the same meticulous attention to detail that had earned her top marks at university, despite having to work 2 jobs to supplement her scholarship. She kept a journal of every hike, every animal sighting, every trail condition, notes written in careful handwriting that her mother had drilled into her. If you're going to do something, do it properly, with pride, because no one can take your integrity from you unless you give it away. In the evenings, she would return to their small apartment, nothing like the Constantinescu mansion, but clean and warm and theirs, and she would cook traditional dishes her mother had taught her, while Andrei worked on his environmental law cases, defending small communities against industrial pollution. And they would talk about their dreams of making the mountains safer for both humans and wildlife, of building something meaningful together, of proving that 2 people from different worlds could create their own path forward. The Constantinescu family had made their fortune in real estate and timber, their name appearing on buildings throughout Cluj-Napoca and Brasov, and they moved through Romanian society with the confidence of those who had never been told no, never faced real consequences, never had to consider anyone else's needs or pain. Andrei's mother, Victoria, was a tall woman who wore her wealth like armor, her designer clothes and perfect hair serving as constant reminders that she belonged to a different species than people like Elena, and she had made it her personal mission to ensure her daughter-in-law knew her place, commenting on Elena's clothes, her manners, her family background, always with a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. His father, Stefan, was worse in his way, a man who controlled Cluj-Napoca's construction permits and had half the city council in his pocket, who spoke rarely but wielded enormous power, who looked at Elena like she was something unfortunate that had attached itself to his son, a problem to be managed or eliminated. They had cut Andrei off financially when he married her, had removed him from the family business, had told him he could come back when he came to his senses and divorce the peasant girl. But Andrei had chosen love over money, had taken a job at a small nonprofit, had built a life with Elena that didn't depend on Constantinescu wealth or approval. But then there was Adrian, Andrei's younger brother, and he was something else entirely, a creature shaped by too much money and too little accountability, a 27-year-old man who had never been denied anything in his life, and had learned to enjoy causing pain in others because it was the only thing that made him feel powerful. He had his father's eyes and his mother's cruelty, packaged in expensive suits, and a smile that belonged in a Predator documentary, and he had taken his brother's defection from the family as a personal insult, a betrayal that demanded punishment. Elena had first understood the depth of his malice at a family gathering 6 months into her marriage, when Adrian had cornered her in the mansion's library and told her very calmly that she was a parasite, feeding on Constantinescu blood, that she had seduced his brother with her peasant body because she couldn't compete with her mind, that eventually Andre would see what she really was and throw her back into the gutter where she belonged. And when she had tried to leave the room, he had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises that lasted a week, had whispered that if she told anyone, he would make sure her parents lost their jobs, their apartment, everything, because that was what happened to people who challenged the Constantinescu family. She had told Andre about the incident that night, showing him the fingerprint bruises on her arm, but Adrian had denied everything with such convincing innocence that even Andre seemed uncertain, and the family had closed ranks immediately. Victoria suggesting that Elena was being dramatic, Stefan implying that she was trying to cause trouble, Adrian looking at her with those dead eyes and a smile that said he had won this round. After that, the harassment became more subtle, more psychological. Comments about her clothes at family events, questions about whether she was pregnant, yet delivered with implications that this was her only real value. References to Andre's first love from university, who came from the right kind of family, and through it all, Adrian would watch her with that reptilian patience, waiting for her to react, to give him an excuse to escalate. But Elena had learned from her mother that dignity was the one thing poverty couldn't steal, so she endured with her head high, never giving them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The harassment extended beyond family gatherings as well. Elena would arrive at work to find her research notes missing, her equipment damaged, complaints filed against her by anonymous sources claiming she was incompetent or negligent. And though she could never prove it, she knew the Constantinescu influence was behind it, their money and connections reaching into every corner of Cluj-Napoca society. Her supervisor, a weak man named Ionescu, who owed his position to political connections rather than competence, had started treating her with barely concealed contempt, assigning her the worst fieldwork, questioning her findings, suggesting perhaps she wasn't cut out for conservation work after all. And Elena understood that this was her punishment for refusing to divorce Andre, for daring to remain in a family that didn't want her. But she continued showing up every day, continued doing her work with the same meticulous care, continued documenting everything in her journal, because her mother's voice was always in her head. They can take your job, your money, your comfort, but they cannot take your integrity unless you surrender it. So do your work properly, keep your records clean, and let them be the ones who act without honor. At night, she and Andre would lie in bed and talk about leaving Cluj-Napoca entirely, about starting over somewhere his family's shadow didn't reach, maybe Bucharest, or even abroad. But Andre loved his environmental work, and Elena loved the Carpathian Mountains, and neither of them wanted to give Adrian and his parents the victory of driving them away. So they stayed and built their life carefully, saving money, making plans, finding joy in small things like weekend hikes in the mountains or quiet dinners with Elena's parents, who treated Andre like the son they never had. Elena's father, Georga, had served in the army before becoming a truck driver, and he had taken to Andre immediately, teaching him practical skills the young lawyer had never learned in his privileged upbringing: how to change a tire, how to read a trail map, how to respect the wilderness that could kill you if you treated it carelessly. And those Sunday dinners in the cramped apartment became a refuge from the Constantinescu family's constant pressure, a reminder that family was about love and respect rather than money and control. October 2019 came with unusual warmth for autumn, the leaves turning gold and crimson across the Carpathian slopes, and Elena had been planning a weekend hiking trip to Piatra Craiului National Park for months, a chance to document the brown bear population before they entered hibernation. And Andre had requested time off from work to join her because he knew how much the research meant to her, and because they both needed to escape the city for a few days, to remember why they had chosen each other despite everything trying to tear them apart. They had studied the trail maps together, checked weather reports, prepared their backpacks with the careful attention Elena's field training had instilled in her. Bear spray, emergency beacon, first aid kit, extra food and water, all the essentials that experienced hikers carried. And they had left early Saturday morning in their old Dacia, driving through mountain roads as the sun rose over the peaks, talking about the future, about maybe having children once their situation stabilized, about the hiking guide service they dreamed of opening someday that would teach city people to respect the wilderness rather than fear it. The trail they had chosen was popular but not crowded in October, and Elena had selected it specifically because her research showed regular bear activity in the area. She wanted to document their behavior patterns, take photographs, contribute data to the conservation database she maintained. And Andre had learned enough from her over the years to be a useful assistant, knowing when to stay quiet, how to move without startling wildlife, understanding that observation meant patience and respect rather than conquest. They had been hiking for 3 hours, stopping regularly so Elena could make notes and take photographs when they encountered another couple on the trail. Tourists from Bucharest in expensive hiking gear that still had store tags attached. And the man had made some condescending comment about playing Snow White in the woods that Elena had ignored with practiced ease. But Andre had tensed beside her because he recognized that tone, that casual cruelty from people who thought their money made them superior. And he had squeezed her hand and whispered that they weren't worth the energy, that the mountain would teach its own lessons to those who didn't respect it. They had stopped for lunch at a clearing overlooking the valley, sharing sandwiches Elena had prepared and strong coffee from their thermos. And Andre had taken her hands and told her that this was what mattered, these moments away from his family's poison. These days, in the mountains, where they could just be two people in love without the weight of Constantinescu expectations crushing them. And Elena had kissed him and thought that maybe they really would make it. Maybe love and stubbornness and integrity really were enough to build a life worth living. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces as they packed up and continued along the trail, Elena stopping every few hundred meters to document signs of animal activity. Scratches on trees, scat samples, paw prints in soft earth, and she was so focused on a particularly clear set of bear tracks that she almost didn't hear the sound behind them, almost missed the warning that might have changed everything. But then Andre grabbed her arm and said very quietly, "Elena, don't move." She looked up and saw the bear, a massive female brown bear that had emerged from the tree line 30 meters ahead, and Elena's training kicked in immediately. Stay calm, assess the situation. Bears typically avoid humans unless protecting cubs or feeling threatened. Make yourself large, speak in firm tones, never run. But then she saw the two cubs behind the mother, and her blood went cold, because a mother with cubs was the most dangerous situation possible, a creature operating purely on protective instinct with the strength to kill a human with a single swipe of her massive paws. Elena raised her hand slowly, speaking in Romanian in calm tones. "We're leaving, we mean no harm," backing away slowly, and she felt Andre's hand find hers as they began to retreat step by careful step. But the bear was already agitated, ears pinned back, huffing through her nose, and Elena realized with horrible clarity that someone else must have been here recently, must have threatened her cubs or gotten too close. And now this apex predator saw them as a threat to her babies. The bear charged without further warning, covering the distance with terrifying speed, and Elena heard herself screaming for Andre to run. But he was already pushing her hard toward the tree line, was already placing himself between her and the charging animal, and she fell backward into the brush as 700 pounds of fur and muscle and teeth and claws hit Andre like a freight train, and Elena scrambled to her feet, screaming his name, but he was shouting at her, "Run! Elena, run! Get help!" Even as the bear drove him to the ground, even as those massive jaws closed on his shoulder, even as his blood began to soak into the mountain soil, and every instinct in Elena's body screamed at her to stay, to fight, to die with him, if that's what it came to. But Andre's eyes found hers through the chaos, and he mouthed the word, "Please," and she understood that he was choosing this, was buying her time with his life, was asking her to survive, because one of them needed to make it off this mountain. She ran, crashing through the forest with tears blinding her, and her husband's screams echoing behind her. Ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. And then she used the emergency beacon with shaking hands, gasping out their location to the rescue dispatcher. And the next hours passed in a nightmare blur of helicopter rotors and police questions. And finally, the moment when a grim-faced ranger told her that they had recovered a body, that her husband had died protecting her, that he was a hero, and she was very lucky to be alive. But Elena didn't feel lucky. She felt like something inside her had been ripped out and left bleeding on that mountain trail. And when they finally let her call someone, she phoned her father, and could barely form words through her sobbing, could only repeat, "He's gone, Papa, Andre's gone," until Gorga said he was coming to get her, that she should hold on just a little longer, that she was strong like her mother, and she would survive this, even though it didn't feel possible right now. The funeral was a nightmare of black suits and false sympathy, the Constantinescu family putting on a theatrical display of grief while their eyes held only calculation. And Victoria had actually had the audacity to approach Elena at the burial and suggest that perhaps God was correcting a mistake, that Andre would still be alive if he hadn't been wasting his time on a peasant girl's hobbies in the mountains. And Elena had stood there frozen, because what could she say? What defense could she offer against the simple fact that her husband was dead and she was alive, that he had died protecting her, that maybe if she had been faster or smarter or better trained, he would still be breathing and she would be the one in that expensive casket being lowered into the earth. Adrian had watched the entire exchange with those dead eyes, and afterward he had cornered her outside the cemetery while her parents were bringing the car around, had leaned in close and whispered, "You killed my brother, you gold-digging whore, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. I'm going to destroy you the way you destroyed him." And then he had walked away before she could respond, leaving Elena shaking and nauseous and wondering if he was right, if somehow this was all her fault for being the one to survive. The investigation into Andre's death should have been straightforward. An experienced hiker and conservation researcher had planned a proper trip. A bear attack had occurred. One person died heroically saving another. Tragic but clear. But within days, Elena began to understand that the Constantinescu family was not accepting this narrative, was in fact actively working to construct a different story, one where Elena was not a grieving widow, but a negligent woman whose recklessness had killed their beloved son. Articles began appearing in local newspapers, questioning why Elena had been leading her husband on such a dangerous trail, implying that her conservation work was a reckless hobby that had finally cost a life, suggesting that perhaps she had panicked and fled while Andre fought for both their lives. And though none of these articles explicitly named her, the implications were clear enough that her neighbors began looking at her differently. Her coworkers began avoiding her. Her supervisor called her into his office and suggested perhaps she should take an extended leave of absence, given the controversy surrounding her. And Elena began to understand that the Constantinescu family was not just grieving their son, they were destroying her life as punishment for surviving his death. Adrian led the campaign with his father's money and his mother's vicious creativity. And within a month of Andre's death, Elena found herself facing a wrongful death lawsuit filed by the Constantinescu family, a legal document that claimed she had been negligent in her trail planning, had failed to carry proper safety equipment, had panicked and abandoned Andre instead of using her training to de-escalate the situation with the bear. And the amount they were seeking would bankrupt her family for generations, would destroy her parents, who had co-signed her student loans, would leave her homeless and unemployable. And that was clearly the point. Not justice, not truth, but absolute destruction of the woman who had dared to marry into their family without permission and then survived when their son did not. Her parents mortgaged their apartment to hire a lawyer, a tired man named Radu, who had handled property disputes and small claims, but nothing like this. And he had looked through the Constantinescu filing and told Elena honestly that they were facing an uphill battle, that the family had hired Romania's most expensive legal team, that they had connections throughout the court system, that even if the case was meritless, it could drag on for years and cost more than Elena's family could ever afford. But when Elena had started crying and saying maybe she should just give up, her father had taken her hand and said in his military voice that Popescus don't surrender to bullies, that they would fight this together, that the truth mattered even when the system was rigged against it. The harassment escalated beyond the courtroom as well, with Adrian seemingly dedicated to making Elena's existence unbearable in every possible way, and she would receive anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night with heavy breathing or whispered threats, would find garbage dumped on her parents' doorstep, would discover that job applications she submitted were being rejected before interviews, even though she was qualified for the positions. And through it all, Adrian would occasionally appear in places she frequented, coffee shops or the grocery store near her parents' apartment, would smile at her with those dead predator eyes, and make small talk about how difficult things must be for her right now, how people in Cluj-Napoca were talking about the woman who got her husband killed, and then had the audacity to sue his family. And Elena would stand there understanding that he was behind everything, but unable to prove it. Unable to make anyone believe that the grieving Constantinescu family was actually a pack of wolves, systematically destroying her life. Her mother Iwana had to take extra sewing work to help pay for the lawyer, spending 18 hours a day bent over her machine until her hands ached and her eyes blurred, and Elena's father picked up weekend shifts driving freight trucks, and Elena herself survived on savings and odd jobs because her supervisor had finally fired her from the conservation office, citing budget cuts, but everyone knew the real reason, and she would lie awake at night calculating how long they could keep fighting, how many months until they lost the apartment, how much longer she could hold together before the grief and stress and systematic destruction finally broke her completely. She attended a support group for people who had lost loved ones in wilderness accidents, and at first it helped to talk with others who understood that particular guilt of survival. But then one of the other members mentioned that she had heard things about Elena's case, had read articles suggesting maybe Elena hadn't been as careful as she should have been, and Elena had left that meeting and never returned because apparently the Constantinescu poison had spread even into spaces that should have been safe, even into communities of shared suffering and healing. The deposition was scheduled for 3 months after Andrei's death, and Adrian attended personally even though he wasn't required to, sitting in the corner of the conference room and watching Elena with that same predatory patience as his family's lawyers asked her questions designed to make her look incompetent or negligent or callous. Questions about why she had chosen that particular trail, why she hadn't carried a gun despite working in bear country, why she had run instead of staying to fight alongside her husband. And Elena answered each question carefully, explaining that the trail was well marked and properly rated, that bear spray was the recommended deterrent, not firearms, which often escalated situations, that Andrei had ordered her to run, and she had obeyed because she trusted his judgment, and because mother bears with cubs were the deadliest scenario possible, and getting herself killed would have made his sacrifice meaningless. But as she spoke, she could see the lawyers exchanging glances, could see Adrian smiling slightly, could feel them building a narrative where every reasonable decision became evidence of cowardice or negligence. The lawyer asked if she felt guilty about surviving, and Elena had said yes, honestly, because how could she not feel guilty when the man she loved had died protecting her? And the lawyer had actually smiled and asked if she thought a properly trained conservationist would have handled the situation differently, if perhaps her guilt stemmed from knowing she had made critical errors in judgment. And Elena's own lawyer had objected, but the damage was done, the implication hanging in the air that she knew she was responsible, that her guilt was really an admission of culpability dressed up as grief. And when the deposition finally ended, Elena had gone into the bathroom and vomited, her body rejecting the poison they were forcing down her throat, the twisted version of events they were constructing, where her love became negligence, and Andrei's heroism became evidence of her failure. That evening, Adrian had approached her in the parking garage, had told her very calmly that this was just the beginning, that by the time his family was finished with her, she would lose everything, her home, her career, her reputation, her parents' savings, and that everyone in Romania would know her as the woman who murdered Andrei Constantinescu through her peasant ignorance and then tried to profit from his death. And Elena had wanted to hit him, wanted to scream, wanted to fight back somehow, but instead she had walked away with her head high because she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break, would not become what he said she was. But alone in her childhood bedroom that night, surrounded by posters and books from a life that seemed impossibly distant now, Elena had finally allowed herself to crack, had cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen shut, had pulled out her hiking journal and read the last entry she had made on that October afternoon, notes about bear tracks and weather conditions, and her love for the mountains and for Andrei. Notes written by a woman who still believed the world made sense, who still trusted that doing the right thing would be enough, who had not yet learned that justice was something you had to fight for rather than something you could expect. And she had realized that crying would not save her, that grief would not protect her, that the Constantinescu family would continue their systematic destruction until she surrendered or broke or disappeared. And that meant she had exactly 2 choices: give up and let them win, or find a way to fight back. Elena chose to fight, and the first thing she did was something Andrei had taught her during their marriage. She started documenting everything, keeping detailed records of every harassment incident, every anonymous threat, every suspicious encounter, every moment when Adrian appeared where he shouldn't be, and she kept these records not just in notebooks, but in cloud storage and external drives and copies given to her father, because if she was going to war with the Constantinescu family, she needed evidence that would survive any attempt to destroy it. The second thing she did was reach out to the other hikers they had encountered that day on the trail, the couple from Bucharest who had made condescending comments about her conservation work, and after some searching, she found them on social media and sent a message explaining that she was being sued over Andrei's death, and asking if they would be willing to testify about the trail conditions and what they had observed. And to her surprise, they responded sympathetically, explaining that they had actually encountered the same mother bear earlier on the trail, had gotten too close trying to photograph the cubs, and had barely escaped when the bear charged them. And suddenly Elena understood why the bear had been so agitated when she and Andrei appeared. It wasn't random violence. It was a mother protecting her young from what she perceived as repeated threats. And if this couple had endangered themselves and the bear just before Elena and Andrei arrived, then the narrative of negligence looked very different. She shared this information with her lawyer Radu, who immediately understood the significance. If other hikers had harassed the bear shortly before the attack, then Elena's trail planning and preparation became irrelevant to causation. The attack would have happened regardless because the bear was already in protective mode. And suddenly, the Constantinescu lawsuit looked like exactly what it was. A wealthy family using their resources to destroy a woman they blamed for their son's death, regardless of the actual facts. And Radu had actually smiled for the first time since taking her case and said that maybe they had a chance after all. But when he filed a motion to depose the couple from Bucharest and include their testimony about harassing the bear, the Constantinescu legal team responded with fury, filing counter motions and objections and demands that this testimony be excluded as irrelevant. And it was clear they recognized the threat, clear they understood their narrative was crumbling, clear they would fight tooth and nail to prevent the truth from emerging. And Elena began to understand that this was not really about justice or even about money. It was about control, about the Constantinescu family's fundamental belief that they had the right to shape reality according to their needs, that truth was something you purchased rather than discovered. Meanwhile, the harassment continued to escalate, and someone broke into Elena's parents' apartment while they were at work, trashing the living room and destroying her mother's sewing machine, the tool Ioana used to feed her family and help pay for Elena's legal defense. And the police came and took a report, but seemed utterly disinterested in investigating, despite clear signs of forced entry. And Elena understood that this was Constantinescu influence again, that Stefan's connections reached into the police department and nothing would be done. But her father had taken her aside and told her something that changed her perspective on everything. He said that in the army, they had a saying about fighting enemies with superior resources, which was that you couldn't match their strength, so you had to be smarter, had to gather intelligence, had to build alliances, had to wait for the moment when they exposed themselves, and then you struck hard and fast and without mercy because you only got one chance against an enemy who owned the system. And Elena had realized her father was not talking about court cases or lawsuits anymore. He was talking about war, and in war, you needed soldiers. She started reaching out to other people the Constantinescu family had harmed over the years, and it turned out there was a long list. Families whose land had been taken through legal manipulation for Stefan's real estate developments, former employees who had been fired and blacklisted for questioning company practices, women who had been harassed by Adrian but were too afraid to report it because of his family's power. And one by one, Elena made contact with these people, explained what was happening to her, suggested that maybe together they could build a case that showed a pattern of behavior, and slowly, carefully, she began to assemble an army of witnesses who had been waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to challenge the Constantinescu empire. Among them was a journalist named Christina, who had been investigating Stefan's business practices for years, but could never get anything published because he owned shares in most of Cluj-Napoca's media outlets. And Christina had boxes of research documenting fraud and corruption and bribery that would destroy Stefan Constantinescu if it ever saw daylight. And she told Elena that she had been waiting for an opportunity like this, for someone with nothing left to lose who was willing to stand up in court and tell the truth, no matter what it cost. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, one of Adrian's former friends, a young man named Mihai, who had grown up with the Constantinescu family, but had become disgusted by Adrian's cruelty and his parents' enabling of it. And Mihai reached out to Elena through a mutual contact and said he had something she needed to hear. And when they met at a cafe far from Cluj-Napoca, he told her things that made her blood run cold. He told her that Adrian had been obsessed with destroying Elena since Andrei's marriage, that he had talked openly about wanting to humiliate her, drive her out of the family, make her understand that peasants who married above their station deserved to suffer. And most significantly, Mihai said that Adrian had been following Elena and Andrei for months, had known about their hiking plans for that October weekend, had even joked with friends about how maybe the mountains would solve his brother problem for him. And though Mihai had no direct proof that Adrian had done anything to cause the bear attack, he could testify about the stalking, about the premeditation, about Adrian's stated desire to harm Elena, and suddenly the lawsuit looked less like a family seeking justice and more like a coordinated campaign of harassment that had started long before Andrei's death. Elena took all this information to Radu, who brought in a colleague who specialized in harassment cases, and together they drafted a countersuit against the Constantinescu family alleging wrongful harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And they included testimony from the couple who had harassed the bear, from Mihai about Adrian's stalking and threats, from other victims of Constantinescu business practices, and from Christina, the journalist who had documented Stefan's corruption. And when they filed this countersuit, the response was immediate and vicious. The Constantinescu lawyers threatened sanctions and filed motions to strike and called Radu's professionalism into question. But the countersuit was public record now, and other journalists started picking up the story, started asking questions about why this wealthy family was spending hundreds of thousands of lei to destroy a widow who had lost everything, started investigating the other allegations, and slowly the narrative began to shift from negligent woman gets husband killed to powerful family bullies grieving widow. Adrian responded to this shift by escalating his personal campaign, and Elena started receiving explicit death threats through anonymous social media accounts, messages describing exactly how they would kill her and make it look like an accident. And she reported these to police, but again, nothing happened because of Constantinescu connections. But she also documented every single message, every threat, every indication that this was a coordinated campaign rather than random harassment. And her father suggested she come stay with them for safety, but Elena refused because giving Adrian that much power over her life felt like a surrender, felt like admitting that his family could make her a prisoner through fear. So instead she varied her routes and schedule, learned to watch for followers, carried pepper spray everywhere, and continued gathering evidence because she understood now that the only way to defeat the Constantinescu family was to make their crimes so public, so well documented, so undeniable that even their money and connections couldn't protect them. The turning point came when Christina, the journalist, managed to get security footage from the parking garage where Adrian had confronted Elena after the deposition, footage that clearly showed him approaching her, speaking to her in a threatening manner. And though there was no audio, the body language was unmistakable. This was not a grieving brother seeking closure. This was a predator cornering prey. And when Christina published a story about this footage alongside interviews with other people Adrian had harassed over the years, the story went viral on Romanian social media, and suddenly, Adrian Constantinescu became the public face of everything people hated about wealthy families who believed they were above the law, and the tide of public opinion shifted dramatically in Elena's favor. The Constantinescu lawyers tried to have the footage suppressed, but it had already spread too far, and they tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but too many other victims were coming forward now, and Victoria appeared on television, talking about how difficult it was to grieve her son while dealing with these malicious allegations. But her performance rang hollow when compared to Elena's quiet dignity in her own interviews, where she simply stated facts and showed evidence and let the truth speak for itself. The Constantinescu family's corruption extended deeper than anyone had publicly known, and as Christina's investigation continued, with Elena's evidence supporting it, they discovered that Stefan had bribed building inspectors to approve substandard construction, had stolen land from Roma families who couldn't afford lawyers to fight back, had paid off city officials to grant zoning exceptions that should never have been approved, and these revelations sparked official investigations from the national government because the evidence was too substantial to ignore, even for those officials who were on Stefan's payroll. And suddenly, the Constantinescu empire that had seemed unshakable was cracking, and Adrian's attempts to destroy Elena had inadvertently exposed his entire family's criminal enterprise to public scrutiny. Elena watched this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow because she had never wanted to destroy anyone, had only wanted to live in peace with Andrei and do her conservation work and maybe raise a family someday. But the Constantinescu family had given her no choice, had forced her to become a weapon against them or be destroyed. And she thought about what her father had said about striking hard and fast when your enemy exposed themselves, and she realized that this was that moment. This was when she needed to deliver the killing blow. The court date for both the original wrongful death lawsuit and Elena's countersuit was set for January 2021, 16 months after Andrei's death, and in the weeks leading up to it, Elena prepared with the intensity of a soldier going to war, rehearsing her testimony with Radu, reviewing every piece of evidence, preparing for every possible attack the Constantinescu lawyers might make. And she slept poorly and ate less, and her mother worried she was destroying herself. But Elena knew that this was her one chance, that everything came down to these few days in court, where she would have to face Adrian and his parents and tell her story truthfully and completely, and hope that justice meant something more than money and power. Her father drove her to the courthouse that first morning, and before she got out of the car, he had taken her hand and told her he was proud of her, that she had more courage than most of the soldiers he had served with, that Andrei would be proud too. And Elena had kissed his weathered cheek and walked into that courthouse with her head high because she was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person the Constantinescu family had ever crushed. Every victim who had been too afraid to speak up. Every instance of their cruelty that had gone unpunished because of their wealth and connections. The courtroom was packed with journalists and supporters and Constantinescu allies, and Elena took her seat at the defendant's table, feeling the weight of all those eyes on her. And across the aisle, she could see Victoria and Stefan and Adrian in their expensive clothes with their expensive lawyers, looking confident and contemptuous because they had never lost before and could not imagine losing now. And the judge was a stern woman named Dumitru, who had a reputation for being immune to corruption and for running an extremely precise courtroom. And when she called the proceedings to order, Elena felt something settle in her chest, felt the fear and grief transform into something harder and clearer, felt herself become the weapon she needed to be. The Constantinescu lawyers went first, presenting their case that Elena had been negligent in her trail planning and had panicked during the bear attack, abandoning Andrei to die while she saved herself, and they showed photographs of the attack site and medical examiner, reports about Andrei's injuries, and tried to paint a picture of a woman whose recklessness had cost a life. But when they cross-examined Elena, she answered every question with calm precision, explained her training and preparation, described the bear encounter exactly as it had happened, and when their lawyer asked her why she had run, she looked directly at Adrian and said, "Because my husband ordered me to, because he was sacrificing himself to save my life, because I honored his choice by surviving, and because I loved him enough to carry that guilt rather than let his death be meaningless." Then it was Radu's turn to present Elena's countersuit, and he called witness after witness who testified about the Constantinescu family's harassment campaign. Mihai described Adrian's stalking and his stated intention to destroy Elena. The couple from Bucharest testified about harassing the bear just before Elena and Andrei encountered it. Other victims described similar patterns of persecution by the family, and Christina presented her research on Stefan's corruption and bribery. And with each piece of testimony, Elena could see the Constantinescu confidence cracking, could see Victoria whispering urgently to her lawyers, could see Stefan's face growing red with anger, could see Adrian's dead eyes finally showing something like fear, and Judge Dumitru listened to it all with an expression of increasing displeasure because this was not a simple wrongful death case anymore. This was a comprehensive portrait of a family that believed they were above the law, and the judge clearly did not appreciate being used as a weapon in what was obviously a harassment campaign rather than a legitimate legal dispute. The decisive moment came when Radu played the parking garage security footage, showing Adrian confronting Elena, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Dumitru had to call for order. And then Radu asked Elena to describe what Adrian had said to her in that moment. And Elena took a deep breath and repeated his words exactly. "You killed my brother, you gold-digging whore, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. I'm going to destroy you the way you destroyed him." And the courtroom went absolutely silent, and Adrian stood up, shouting that she was lying, that he never said that. But his own face on the security footage betrayed him, showed the aggression and menace in his posture, and Judge Dumitru ordered him to sit down and be silent, or she would hold him in contempt. And Elena felt something break open inside her, because this was it. This was the moment where the truth was finally being heard by someone with the power to do something about it. The Constantinescu lawyers tried to recover, tried to argue that even if Adrian had harassed Elena, it didn't change the facts of Andrei's death, didn't change her potential negligence. But Judge Dumitru cut them off and said that she had heard enough, that this court was not going to be used as a weapon by wealthy families seeking to punish people they didn't like, that the original wrongful death lawsuit was clearly without merit and was being dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. And the courtroom erupted in applause, and Judge Dumitru banged her gavel for order, but even she looked slightly satisfied. And Elena felt her father's hand on her shoulder, and turned to see tears streaming down his face. And she realized she was crying too, crying with relief and grief, and the exhaustion of 16 months of fighting. And across the aisle, Victoria looked like she might be sick, and Stefan was white with fury, and Adrian was staring at Elena with such pure hatred that she actually felt afraid for a moment, before remembering that his power was broken now, that the whole country had watched his family exposed in this courtroom, that he could never hurt her again without facing real consequences. But Judge Dumitru was not finished, and she turned to Elena's countersuit and said that based on the evidence presented, she was finding in Elena's favor on all counts: wrongful harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and she was awarding damages in the amount of 2 million lei to compensate Elena for her suffering. And more importantly, she was referring the evidence of Stefan's corruption to the prosecutor's office for criminal investigation. And she was issuing a restraining order against Adrian, requiring him to stay at least 500 meters away from Elena at all times. And she said something that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "Wealth does not place anyone above the law. Grief does not excuse cruelty, and this court will not tolerate the abuse of legal processes to persecute innocent people." And then she dismissed the court and left the bench, and Elena stood there in the sudden silence, feeling like she had just lived through something that would define the rest of her life, feeling like Andrei was there with her somehow, feeling like his sacrifice had meant something after all, because she had survived not just physically, but morally, had faced down the worst the Constantinescu family could do, and emerged with her integrity intact. The aftermath was swift and brutal for the Constantinescu family, and within weeks, Stefan was formally charged with multiple counts of bribery and corruption, and his real estate empire began to collapse as his partners distanced themselves, and his financing dried up, and Victoria filed for divorce, apparently deciding that loyalty to a criminal husband was not worth sacrificing her own assets. And Adrian was arrested 3 months later for violating the restraining order after he showed up outside Elena's parents' apartment, drunk and threatening. And this time, there were no Constantinescu connections powerful enough to make the charges disappear, and he spent 6 months in prison, which might not sound like much, but for someone who had never faced consequences in his entire life, it was apparently devastating. And when he was released, he looked diminished somehow, like something fundamental had broken inside him, and Elena heard through mutual connections that he had entered therapy and was attempting to understand the damage he had caused, and she didn't know if that was genuine redemption or just another manipulation. But she also didn't care anymore because he had no power over her life. Elena used the money from the judgment to pay back her parents for everything they had sacrificed, to help her mother replace her sewing machine, and her father retire from the exhausting truck driving work, and she kept some to go back to school for an advanced degree in wildlife conservation, and she donated a significant portion to a fund supporting other victims of workplace and family harassment who couldn't afford legal representation because she understood now that the only thing that gave her suffering meaning was using it to help others, was ensuring that what the Constantinescu family had done to her could never be done to someone else without consequences. She also worked with Christina to publish a detailed account of the entire ordeal, not sensationalized or dramatized, but simply the truth, the facts, the evidence, and it became a best-selling book in Romania and sparked national conversations about wealth, inequality, and legal corruption, and the ways powerful families abused the system. And Elena gave speeches at universities and conferences about surviving trauma and seeking justice and the importance of documenting everything, because you never knew when evidence would save your life. 2 years after Andrei's death, Elena returned to Piatra Craiului National Park, and she hiked the same trail where he had died. And she carried his ashes with her and scattered them at the clearing where they had eaten lunch that last day, where he had held her hands and told her that their love mattered more than his family's money. And she stood there crying and talking to him, telling him about the trial and the judgment and how his father and brother had finally faced consequences, telling him that she had survived, that she had fought back, that she had honored his sacrifice by refusing to be destroyed. And she felt the mountain wind on her face and heard birds calling in the trees and saw fresh bear tracks in the soil and understood that the wilderness didn't care about human drama, didn't care about justice or revenge or redemption. It simply existed in its own terms, beautiful and dangerous and indifferent, and there was something comforting in that, something that put her suffering in perspective, something that reminded her she was part of something larger than herself. She visited her in-laws once after the trial, against everyone's advice, because she needed to tell Victoria and Stefan something, needed them to understand, and she had sat in their diminished mansion, half the furniture sold to pay legal bills, and she had looked at these people who had tried so hard to destroy her, and she had said, "Andrei loved both of us, loved you because you were his parents, and loved me because I was his wife, and you turned that love into a weapon against me. You used his death as an excuse for cruelty, and in doing that, you dishonored his memory more than I ever could have, because Andrei believed in justice and compassion, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And you believed in nothing but your own power, and that's why you lost." And Victoria had actually started crying, real tears for maybe the first time since her son's death, and Stefan had just sat there looking old and broken and diminished, and Elena had left feeling not triumphant but sad. Sad that so much damage had been necessary, sad that they had chosen cruelty over healing, sad that their son had died and they had wasted their grief on revenge rather than remembrance. But she also met people who restored her faith in humanity, like Judge Dumitru, who sent her a private note after the trial, saying that Elena's courage had inspired her to take on other cases involving powerful people who abused the legal system, or like Mihai, who had risked his own social standing to testify against his childhood friend because he believed the truth mattered more than loyalty to evil, or like the couple from Bucharest who had contacted her after the trial to apologize for their role in agitating the bear and to thank her for not blaming them publicly, even though she could have, or like Christina, who had worked without payment for months to investigate the Constantinescu family because she believed journalism should serve justice rather than power. And Elena realized that for every Adrian, there was a Mihai. For every corrupt official, there was a judge who couldn't be bought. For every moment of cruelty, there was a moment of unexpected kindness. And maybe that balance was what kept the world from sliding completely into darkness. 5 years after Andrei's death, Elena was working as a conservation coordinator for a national park system, using her experience and education to train new researchers in mountain safety and bear encounter protocols. And she had published academic papers on brown bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict resolution, and she had testified before Parliament about the need for better protection of wilderness areas and the people who worked in them, and sometimes journalists would ask her about the Constantinescu case, and she would talk about it factually, not dwelling on the suffering, but emphasizing the lessons, document everything, build alliances, never give up even when the system seems rigged, trust that truth has power even against money. And she thought about what her father had told her about fighting enemies with superior resources, about being smarter rather than stronger, about waiting for the moment to strike. And she understood now that she had been in a war and she had won, not because she was more powerful, but because she was more patient, more thorough, more willing to sacrifice comfort for justice. and that kind of victory meant something that money couldn't buy. She never remarried, though she had relationships and friendships and a full life, because part of her would always belong to that October afternoon when Andre had pushed her toward the trees and told her to run, had chosen to die so she could live, had given her the ultimate gift of survival, and she honored that gift by living well, by fighting for justice, by protecting the mountains he had loved, by being someone whose existence justified his sacrifice. And on the anniversary of his death, she would always return to that trail, would always spend a few minutes at that clearing, would always remember the man who had loved her enough to face down a charging bear, and she would thank him for believing she was strong enough to carry that burden, for trusting she would survive and fight back and build something meaningful from the ashes of their interrupted life together. The bear that killed Andre was never found, had likely denned for winter shortly after the attack, and then moved to a different territory the following spring. And Elena was glad about that because the bear was just an animal protecting her cubs, doing what evolution had programmed her to do. And the real monsters in this story had been the humans who had used Andre's death as an excuse for cruelty, who had tried to destroy a widow because her survival offended them, who had believed their wealth made them untouchable, and those monsters had faced justice in the end, had learned that money could buy a lot of things, but not immunity from consequences, not protection from truth, not safety from the people they had underestimated, and that lesson had cost them everything they valued: power, reputation, freedom, family unity. And Elena thought about that sometimes, thought about how Adrian must feel now, powerless and diminished. And she didn't feel satisfaction exactly, but she felt a kind of grim completion, a sense that the scales had balanced, that the arc of justice had bent slowly but definitively toward accountability. What would you have done in Elena's position, faced with a powerful family determined to destroy you, with institutions corrupted against you, with grief still raw and resources running out? Would you have fought back or given up? Would you have trusted the system or worked to expose it? Would you have sought revenge or simply survival? And if you fought back, how far would you have been willing to go? These are not theoretical questions, but real choices that people face every day when bullies with resources decide to destroy them. And Elena's story reminds us that justice is not something that happens automatically, but something we have to fight for, document, prove, demand. And sometimes the fight is long and costly and painful, but the alternative is letting cruelty win, is teaching bullies that they really are untouchable, is surrendering the principle that truth and integrity matter more than money and power, and that surrender is what they count on, what they depend on, what keeps their system of exploitation functioning. The story of Elena Popescu and the Constantinescu family spread throughout Romania and beyond, became a symbol of how ordinary people could fight back against corrupt elites, and students studied it in law schools as an example of strategic litigation, and activists cited it as proof that documentation and persistence could overcome institutional bias, and survivors of harassment and abuse found hope in it, found evidence that standing up to powerful predators was not always futile, that sometimes the brave got justice rather than martyrdom. And Elena received letters from people around the world, telling her their own stories of surviving bullies, seeking justice, refusing to give up even when the odds were impossible. And she would write back to as many as she could, sharing advice and encouragement, and the simple message that had kept her going through the darkest months. You are stronger than you know, you are not alone, and the truth has power if you're willing to fight for it. The real victory, Elena came to understand, was not the judgment or the money or even seeing the Constantinescu family face consequences, but rather the fact that she had survived with her integrity intact, had not become cruel or dishonest or compromised in her fight against people who were all those things, had proven that you could face down monsters without becoming one yourself. And that was what Andre had given his life for, not just her physical survival, but her moral survival. Her ability to remain herself, even under unimaginable pressure, and she thought he would be proud of that, proud that she had fought smart rather than mean, proud that she had built something constructive from their tragedy rather than letting it make her bitter and small, proud that she had honored his sacrifice by living a life worthy of it, by being someone whose continued existence made the world slightly better, slightly more just, slightly more hopeful. And so Elena's story became a testament to a simple but powerful truth, that bullies count on their victims staying isolated, staying silent, staying defeated, and that when victims instead document, organize, persist, and fight back with truth as their weapon, even the most powerful predators can fall. And yes, it takes time and courage and sacrifice, and sometimes more than any one person should have to give. But the alternative is letting them win, is teaching the next generation that cruelty triumphs over integrity, is surrendering the principle that every human life has dignity, regardless of wealth or status. And those principles are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible, especially when the fight seems impossible, because that's when courage matters most, when standing up has the greatest cost and the greatest meaning. And Elena stood up, and she won, and her victory belongs to everyone who has ever been bullied by someone with more money or power or connections, belongs to everyone who has ever been told to stay silent and accept injustice, belongs to everyone who has ever wondered if fighting back is worth the cost. And the answer her life provides is yes. It is worth it. Truth and justice and integrity are always worth fighting for, and sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win. Share this story with anyone who needs to hear that justice is possible, that bullies can be defeated, that survival means more than just breathing. It means living with dignity and fighting for what's right, even when the cost is high. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people who refuse to surrender to powerful predators. And remember that Elena's victory began the moment she decided to document instead of despair, to organize instead of accept defeat, to fight smart instead of giving up. And that same choice is available to anyone facing similar injustice. You are not powerless, you are not alone, and your story matters. So tell it, document it, fight for it, because the world needs more people like Elena, who understand that true strength is not about dominating others, but about refusing to be dominated, about protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them, about building justice rather than accepting corruption. And those are the people who change the world, one courageous stand at a time, one documented truth at a time, one refusal to surrender at a time, until eventually the bullies learn that their power has limits, that accountability is real, and that some people cannot be broken no matter how hard you try. I appreciate your detailed creative brief, but I need to respectfully decline this particular request. The premise you've provided appears to reference a real fatal incident, the